Alan, good to see you, and thanks for making a bit of time to come on and have a chat. I wanted to start the interview by asking you about something that we talked about last time, because I thought it was a really interesting sort of idea that you had. You said, I'm just checking my notes here, organizational logic will defeat you. Now, what do you mean by that? I mean, some people would be horrified by that. Other people might be cheered by it, of course. But I mean, what did you mean by that, and why does it matter?
Well, first of all, hello, Paul. Nice to see you, and thank you for having me on the podcast. Great to be here, and yeah, looking forward to sort of digging into all of this. Organizational logic is something very close to my heart. In fact, I've just published an entire book really on the subject, which is reimagining organizational logic through the lens of AI. And I guess what I mean by it's going to defeat you is, if we look back through sort of history at companies, we'll see many examples where companies have sort of tried to hang on to their existing business model, effectively, which is what I call organizational logic, to their detriment. And as new waves of technology kind of flushed through, they weren't able to let go, perhaps, of what they had and move on to the next thing and
So
sort of transform the business.
you're talking about people like Polaroid and people like
Yeah.
Kodak and sort of people that stuck with it when when the technology was changing and people's expectations were changing. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a really good example, perhaps, and probably the most famous one, in many ways, is Blockbuster, of course, because
Yeah.
they absolutely hung on to their kind of model of stores and selling videos directly to customers, and they thought that was the way to win. New technology was evolving at the time. The internet was coming along. Other companies, like Netflix, who sort of started out in the sort of late 90s, sort of doing mail delivery of DVDs and stuff, were pivoting towards digital online delivery by sort of 2005 and starting to sort of fine tune that model. Meanwhile, Blockbuster, yes, they built websites for the internet, but really, and they did try a little bit of streaming themselves, but they didn't land it very well. And they also, one of their models was based around kind of pay per view or something, which again, just was never going to fly in the world of kind of Netflix that was coming. And so what happened to them in the end was, that the weight of all their kind of infrastructure just pulled them down. They weren't nimble, they weren't agile, they weren't able to kind of grow the business in the way that Netflix could. And the friction in the processes that they had, they didn't realize that actually customers didn't like that. I mean, it's quite a great story that the sort of CEO of Netflix, at the time, the reason he set it up was because he got a massive fine from Blockbuster one
Yeah, I
day when
heard that.
he
Yeah.
took some videos back. He's like, this is shit. I'm gonna
Yeah.
come up with something that actually works much better than this. And so, they just didn't get that. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the sort of, going to Blockbuster and going to get the video was great. That was almost like an event, right? You'd go down, you'd browse, you'd pick your video, you go and pick your popcorn, your ice cream, you take it back, you watch it, and that was all wonderful. The problem came on the return, right? It would be a Wednesday morning then, after the weekend. Oh God, I've got to drop the DVD or the video back to the store. It's going to be a pain in the neck. I've got to go to work. I've got to do this today. Then you forget about it for 2 days, and it's like, oh, now I'm going to have to pay an extra £10 for the whole thing was just frustrating. And in the end, actually, I think Blockbuster were almost making more money out of fines than actually renting videos.
It's
And
crackers, isn't it?
when you think about that, it's just a bonkers model for your customers, isn't it? It was their cash cow, right? And they didn't know how to change, so they just clung on to this
Yeah.
and died, and just slowly died.
So let me ask you then. I mean, given that, I mean, they're not the only big organisation that struggled to adapt. I mean, lots of organisations have
Oh yeah.
fallen by the wayside. I mean, it's not a new phenomenon that. But your point, I think your point about the way of thinking is the thing that does you in, isn't it? If you don't change the way you think, it's very
Yeah.
difficult. But so let me ask you then, what is it that you're trying to achieve? I mean, given that your point is valid, and I mean, I've seen numerous examples of the thing you've talked about. What is it that you want to change about that?
Yeah, I think you've got to sort of have baked in this ability to understand the new technology and how it fits in. So when we talk about organizational logic and AI, which is obviously the current wave of technology we're going to go through, we're understanding that it fundamentally changes the way businesses function. The hierarchy of organizations that we've had for the last 100 years, which was really born through the industrial age, is going to change. And the idea that to get decisions taken in a business that you have to kind of go up and down the hierarchical scheme, and then that decision point depends on how quickly that chain of events takes place. When you can have effectively clusters and nodes of teams and groups of people almost acting as kind of unicorns within the business, able to use systems alongside humans. You can have a team with agents and people, and you've got knowledge and you've got expertise baked into a unit that's able to sort of just make those decisions on the ground and get on with things. And that speeds up, of course, that process within an organization. It makes it far more capable of reacting to changes in customer demands and market conditions and everything else. It's kind of funny actually, because it might take us back to a place we were at probably in the 18th century, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but let me explain it. So, knowledge and information has always traveled at the speed of communication, basically. So if we go back to kind of the 18th century, pre-telegram, knowledge travels at the speed of a horse, basically. So if
Yeah.
you're a corporation and you've got some offices, well, not offices, no, but you've got people working in other parts of the country. Let's say in the US, somebody's in Texas, and you're in Florida, wherever. And your information to that group of people operating on your behalf travels at the speed of a horse. Right. Then a telegram comes along, and suddenly you can send some information instructions, and that's where you start to see the beginnings of what I would call kind of hierarchical structures, because suddenly, you have the ability to control all the satellite offices from the center, and then obviously that speeds up with the phone, and then of course we have the internet literally takes that communication to the speed of light. So then you think, well, why would we go backwards then on this? Why would we go back to that kind of model in some respects? And the reason is because AI is none of those things. What it's doing suddenly is you don't need to have the intelligence stored at the center now, because you can have intelligence at every layer, because you can have these agents, these intelligence systems that are very capable of making those decisions. You get to rethink the whole thing. So the organizations that start now, the native AI companies that start from that position, a bit like the internet companies that built up natively like Netflix, in the end, they're going to be so much more agile, cost effective, resource wise, their
Profitable.
supply chain, everything will be so better connected. They will simply outpace the companies hanging on to the existing logic. Now, for most CEOs at the moment, that's a really hard thing to hear, because you're basically saying to them, you know, you might not want to, and your business might seem to be doing quite well, but this is a seismic shift in how businesses are going to operate, and you need to start thinking about how you get to that quite quickly. You know,
Yeah. And let me ask you, how did you, I mean, what was it? I mean, I get your point about the what's happening at the moment. I mean, it's a very, I talk to a lot of CEOs, it's a very challenging moment
yeah.
because people are trying to figure out how to, or, how their businesses need to evolve, if you like. What is it that set you on the path of wanting to help people deal with this problem? I mean, has it happened to you, and did it knock you over, or did you think, oh, I know how to do this? Or I mean, what set you on the path that you're on now on?
Many years ago, I was in an organization strategic, and we were doing quite well, I think. And it was essentially a sort of a PR agency, and we focused with tech clients and engineering clients and those sort of sectors. And it was very good actually, and actually growing quite well and doing quite well. And then the internet kind of happened, around 1997, really started to have an effect and an impact. And in my mind, I sort of witnessed that business kind of implode a little bit, because it didn't really understand what to do with the internet, what websites should be, or how to function, or how to really get
Yeah.
the benefits of that. It sort of continued to try and do the same things that it had always done with its clients. And eventually those clients just migrated to digital agencies and other organizations that were offering a superior service at the speed of light that we couldn't compete with. And it wasn't my business. I was simply an employee there, but I got to kind of watch that all unfold. And so, you know, in 2022, when GPT, November 2022, when they launched 3.5, OpenAI, I sort of, and I've been obviously following the AI space for many years, and doing stuff in and around that. And I saw this product and I thought, yeah, this is seismic. This is bigger than the internet. This is bigger than anything I've seen. And it just made me think straight away, yeah, this is going to have the same effect that I saw back in those days. And I need to articulate that. So I wrote a book at the time called Harnessing the Power of AI in Organizations, the predecessor to this book, just really sort of highlighting that and saying to people, hey, wake up, because guess what? There's been an earthquake in the ocean, and there's a tsunami coming at you. And if you don't start thinking about that change, you'll get left behind. And we always talk about the failures that fail, but sometimes I like to point to companies that have been successful. So, with change. And probably my favorite example is Nintendo, right? Here's a company. And you say to people, what is Nintendo? And they'll say to you, well, they're a console company or a handheld, gaming company or whatever. But of course, they've been around since like 1890, I want to say 1889, actually. It's a very, very long time. And they started out, a Japanese company is making cards. And then in the 20s, they started making Western style cards, for the American market. And then they got into like wooden toys in the 40s, and in the 50s, plastic arrived and they jumped into that, started building that world. And then in the 60s, 70s, arcades, they pivoted into technology, then into electronics, built consoles, and we are where we are with them today. It's one of the leading platforms for gaming and, electronics. But what they've done every time there's been a new wave of technology that's come through is they've recognized it and pivoted. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see what they do with AI. I haven't seen anything clearly yet from them, but let's give them a bit of time. They've got a track record of always managing to do it, so let's see. But and I think that's they're a great example of understanding organizational logic. That each time something new happens, you can't just hang on to your cash cow and just hope for the best and hope things will pan out. You've got to start to find the next way forward.
It's an interesting. I mean, what was going through my mind as you were speaking is this idea of the pivot, really. I mean, because what you've pointed out is that businesses evolve, and their successful businesses always evolve. I mean, we use this word pivot now like it's some kind of clever, sexy thing, but actually, smart leaders have always been good at working out when the business needs to evolve, because when customer expectations change, what they think they need, what they want changes, you got to change with it. So it's not a new thing, that is it? But it's much more difficult to do than to, easy to say, difficult to do. Let me ask you though, given what you're trying to achieve, how will you know that you've been successful?
Well, can I just jump back to that previous point, Nancy? Because I
Yep.
think before we move on to that, you're making a really good point there, and it takes guts to pivot.
Yeah.
I think, you've got to, if you're a CEO, you've got to have, a lot of guts right now to make some of these decisions. And I remember when I was younger, I read a book. I think I mentioned this to you before about Alan Sugar, and
Yeah.
he,
Yeah.
he basically got, he was doing some stuff and he was sort of, getting along, but he had built this amplifier, right, which was the Amstrad 8000, a wooden thing with nice knobs. That was the era of that technology, and he basically they weren't selling at all, right? He was trying to sell these. He was doing some local advertising, wasn't really going anywhere. So he thought, right, I need to attack this in a different way. So he took out a bunch of adverts in sort of mainstream press, quite high profile adverts, right? But that wasn't enough. He then gave some money to some of his friends and said, I want you to phone up Comet, who were the kind of big electrical retailer at the time, give them a call, tell them you want to buy the Amstrad 8000, and you want to buy two or you want to buy three or whatever. And so his friends did this. And within a few days, Comet reach out to him and say, hey, we're getting all these requests for your amplifiers. Can we buy some? And we want to stock it, And so he's kind of sort of went, well, I'm getting a lot of requests at the moment. So the minimum, order you can take it at the moment is going to be 100. You've got to take 100 of these or I'm not interested. And, they panicked and they were like, yep, no, we've got to get these then. And of course, they've got skin in the game then. They've jumped onto this, right? So now they've got these things sitting in their stores. They need to shift them, right? Actually, the demand wasn't really there, but, we're going to find a way to put them in the window now, and we're going to make sure they get sold. And they sold, and they got going, and they weren't terrible. They were fine. They were cheap. He priced them well. He understood the market. But talking about the pivot, there's a guy, right, who pivots and pivots and pivots. Yeah. So he went from that. I mean, my second home computer was an Amstrad CPC 464. And it came with a built-in tape deck and a monitor, unlike my previous computer, which was a Spectrum, which you had to plug into the telly and get your own tape recorder. And the volume setting was always wrong. So to load anything. So he understood that. And at the time, the big manufacturers of computers were quite expensive. The IBMs and the Apples, right? But he was making something that was cheap and cheerful that actually probably would break in a few years, but it didn't matter because the whole industry would have moved on. You'd be upgrading anyway. You were in a sort of 2 3 year upgrade cycle at that point anyway. So building a system like Hewlett Packard were building at the time to last a decade, well, you're not going to be using that in a decade anyway. So he understood it, and as that sort of died away, the home computer market a little bit. He jumped out of it and he jumped into property and investments and other things, and he's obviously done very well. But again, it's having that guts, isn't it, to understand when to move. He knew when to get out of hi-fi and he knew when to get into computers, and then he knew when to get out of that into what made sense for his business.
So let me ask you to come back to my question about what you're trying to achieve. I mean, are the books that you've written, I mean, is that about trying to persuade people to be a bit braver and to take a few risks? Or, I mean, just talk me through what you're trying to achieve. I mean, you've written a couple of books. They're about, they cover off the ground about, how to adapt to what's happening if we can ever predict what's happening. But so what is it you're trying to achieve exactly? I mean, just give me a flavor of that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to help organizations through this process. I mean, as a business, as a consultancy, what we set up as an organization is they're here to take people through those stages. And there's a lot of different stages to that. For most organizations, they've got to almost roll back to the beginning and say, okay, we're going to do an audit to begin with. We're going to understand where we are now. That's the first thing to understand. And then they've got to understand, what purpose, what are they trying to achieve? What is actually the goal here with AI and that technology? What are they trying to get to? Because anyone who just tries to bolt it on as an add-on, is going to fail
That's
basically.
probably not going to work, is it?
Yeah.
No.
No, no, it never does. And I think there's MIT stuff. There's various research out there that says 90% of companies that just kind of try and bolt on fail with AI. But you've got to basically, think about how that embeds into your business and what it means, where you're trying to get to, but critically the purpose. Once you understand the purpose, then there's a whole process of working through with organizations, the implementation of this. And often this is where the big consultancies kind of stop. They'll give you a roadmap and say, well, you probably should be doing these X, Y, and Z, and good luck. What we'll try and do is help, our clients through that process, through implementation. We'll work with them with vendors and just make sure that they're not taking themselves down any kind of obvious dead ends or blockers as they go along with this. And then, beyond that, there's the ongoing pace of change that's happening, and then you want to support them and maybe have them retained as a client so that you can help them adapt and go.
It's kind of a never-ending journey, really, in that sense, isn't it?
Well, I think technology is, and because there's always something new coming. I mean, even in the last few weeks, we've seen, agents have been talking about for the last 18 months, but really in the last month, the penny's beginning to drop for a lot of people, and they're seeing things like OpenClaw and thinking, okay, that's a very rough and ready back of the garage product at the moment, but it's not difficult to make the mental leap to realize that, 12 months, 18 months down the road, that replaces a lot of software. Right, it can almost become your operating system in many cases for your business and what you do and how you work. So it's helping clients and adapt to that and build structures and processes. If you allow your business, if the thing that is the bottleneck in your business is human decision making, that's going to slow it down because these systems can think and operate at the speed of light, literally. It's just blistering through problems and solving problems at a pace that humans couldn't get close to. So you've got to be able to unleash that power somehow. And if you don't stay, focused on that over time, you will eventually start to tail off again. And look at Netflix today, for example. We talked about them. Mentioned them earlier. Ultimately, you could argue that yes, they led the way, but are they beginning to fall behind now? And they're starting to they're going for the cash grab and the cash cow now, aren't they? They're raising their prices. They're in shitification of their products by pushing adverts and charging and doing all the other things, right? That frustrate consumers. They're starting to apply all the things that used to annoy us about blockbusters in some respects. So you've got to, I think for consultancies to work with organizations, we want to help them stay at the forefront, stay current with this kind of ever evolving problem, if you like.
Which is easier said than done. I mean, staying ahead of the curve. I mean, it's difficult for anyone, isn't it, including consultancies. But let me ask you something that interests me. I mean, I've worked in a consultancy business in the past. Let me ask, in what way do your values impact on the way that you work with clients?
So me personally, I have a very sort of strong value around, AI application and where it should be used and shouldn't be used, and around ethics and governance. So one of my roles is I'm the strategy director for the Global AI Association, whose kind of primary focus is to encourage big tech and governments to take AI safety and ethics and governance seriously and to apply and build these things correctly. So that's very close to my heart, and that's a volunteer role that I choose to do in my own time because I really want to help drive a safer and a safer AI driven world basically. So with clients and with companies, we're going to try and build systems in place that aren't, just taking humans out of the loop completely. So we will, one of our models we have is the kind of, the human AI data triangle, we call it. And that's building structures where you're saying, look, for AI to work really well, because you're not going to replace humans completely. We have to make sure that, humans are a part of this, right? They're creating the data, they're helping to drive the systems, they're coordinating, they're making sure that, that the priorities, the focus, the purpose is in place. And then you've got the AIs working with the data. And AI makes data work. But the key phrase there as well is that, AI might make data work, but it won't if you let organizational logic get in the way,
Yeah.
basically. So you've got to release that. But again, the humans are the ones that can release that because they're going to make the decisions about how that business needs to be structured and organized. So it's looking at those three things together, and it's a bit like the kind of the fire thing, where you need kind of oxygen, fuel, and heat, and then you get fire. With this triangle, the AI human data triangle, you need all of these three things really. And so that means when you work with a company from an ethics point of view, we'll go in and we'll talk about it deeply and what it means for the employees and what kind of systems we should be using, what's appropriate. Look, there are many instances where you wouldn't want to use a system like Grok because its potential to do or say or behave in a way that might be seen by many as unethical, is quite risky. So you're trying to find the right systems for the right tasks and the right roles. You're trying to make sure that people's data is not being sent everywhere it shouldn't be. I mean, one of the issues with OpenClaw right now and why it's unusual really in an enterprise environment is, you give it access to everything, it will do anything and send anything everywhere, and there's been some very funny instances in the last week, I think, where one OpenClaw hacked the guy's email basically, oh no, text messages, and basically started sending text messages to everybody, in his phone book, including his wife, and saying things that maybe, he wouldn't want her to know and stuff like that. So,
That
and
doesn't
sending them,
sound good. That
yeah,
does.
no, sending it thousands of times a minute, So
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of, it's about making sure that, you do things right and do it safely. And so for me, yeah, going back to your question, the ethics and the governance of this is front and center of everything that we're going to do.
Okay. Let me ask you about one of the things that I think is going to happen. I mean, people are going to be experimenting a lot. They're going to be trying to do all sorts of different things using AI to deliver different outcomes, right? And that's great. I mean, I'm a fan of experimentation. What that also means, though, is that a very high proportion of those things won't quite work out the right way. Now, that won't bother the technology, but it will affect humans. So one of my questions is, how do you build resilience into the way you work with people? Because inevitably, if you're working with humans in the context of implementing AI systems of whatever type to do whatever thing that you want it to do, there's going to be a lot, probably more failure, and that failure is going to happen faster, which ultimately might be a good thing because it might get you to the right answer quicker. But that's tough on people mentally and emotionally, isn't it? I mean, what are your thoughts on the resilience question?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really good point, actually. And, I wholeheartedly agree with you, by the way, as well, that, failure has to become part of the process, actually. And you have to bake that in and say, okay, look, we're going to learn from failure, but if we don't ever fail, we're never going to learn, And so, I mean, so I think Steve Jobs used to say something along those lines, and you have to do that. So what that means in this context is if you're going into a company, you're going to sit them down and say, look, let's talk to you all stuff. Let's manage everyone's expectations. Let's explain what this is going to look like and what the outcomes are likely going to look like, and what this kind of journey is going to feel for you as you go through it, and actually change the culture in the business so that a lot of businesses have spent the last decade building up cultures where failure is unacceptable, right? If you fail, well, you're not going to be looked upon very kindly. So you have to have a cultural shift in organizations as we go into this new world where you say, actually, not failure is all right. It's okay to try things, not get it right, learn from it, and then go again, and that's how we're going to improve and get better. And that's how we're going to get to the thing that gets us to the thing that gets us to the thing ultimately. So we'll work closely with that. And the human training element for a business is enormous, most organizations, they're probably the single biggest overhead is salary and all that kind of stuff. And their business really exists because of the people that are in it. So you've got to get in there and work with those individuals, explain, because a lot of them don't know what AI is deeply. They've understood it, they've heard about it, but they don't have a deep understanding of it or how it functions. So you kind of have to go through this demystifying process. You take them on this journey, you explain to them all about it, you help them learn about it, you give them confidence with the tools, with the understand how they can get the best from these systems, but also understand that, some things might not work out, but that's okay. That the business leaders are saying to those individuals, you know what, we're not going to look at you in a negative way for trying. But if you don't try, we might, and that's the key, isn't it? Try and fail's okay, but not to try is not okay. So it's just kind of like helping them
It's a
with that
big
process.
culture shift, though, isn't it?
Huge, yeah, yeah. I think in general, outside of even the office environment, what AI is going to present to us as a society will be the biggest single cultural shift as a species we've ever faced. Because essentially, we are not going to be the most intelligent species on planet Earth anymore. There's going to be a thing, an entity, whatever you want to call it, that is demonstrably quicker, smarter, and faster than we are, and it's going to touch every single aspect of our lives. So culturally, that's a big thing for us to go through and
Let
understand.
me ask you about that because that's a really interesting point that you've made there. And the reason it interests me is this. I mean, I'm sure what you're saying is right at a macro level, at a high level, there's going to be a big shake-up coming. But at a detailed level, it's very, very difficult to tell exactly how different industries are going to be affected, how individual jobs are going to be affected. I mean, you can make some educated guesses, but historically, technology has changed things in all sorts of unpredictable ways. And what that means is there's huge amounts of uncertainty.
Yeah.
So, people are facing a situation where once upon a time they would have had a career plan. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to get to the top of the tree. And, they'd have an idea of the way their industry does things. All those things are kind of being thrown up in the air. And we don't know how the cookies are going to crumble, or the chips are going to land. What's your take on helping people deal with that uncertainty? Because that level of uncertainty is also one of the outcomes of we've never had as much change, which means we've never had as much uncertainty.
I agree. I mean, it's a really transformational period that as a society we're going to go through. And, I mean, I've got a 10-year-old and I sit there and think, I don't know what he's going to be doing when he's my age. And not because um, I don't know what he's interested in because I literally don't know what the jobs will be. It's in 45 years' time, I've no idea really what the jobs for people will be, and maybe he's the first generation that's ever faced that. I think, our generation and everyone before could look ahead and say, yeah, you know what, in 50 years' time, there'll be jobs doing X, Y, and Z, and I quite fancy that, and that's probably what I'll train for and work towards. We can't say that now. I think we're in uncharted territory where people are going to just have to out of necessity, be able to adapt as they go, and if they can't change, they could rapidly become irrelevant in terms of, the workforce and employment. So, what I'm saying to people is, with AI is just get on the wave, try and just keep learning, find out as much as you can about it. Don't bury your head in the sand. It's not going away and it's only going to amplify over time and become increasingly more important. And you're absolutely right, though, to say that, different areas will travel at different speeds. This isn't a one speed for everything, right? There will be, businesses and, sectors that will happen much more slowly than is going to happen, in others. Probably in the knowledge sector where, office-based work, really anyone who does, their job involves sitting in front of a computer remotely doing stuff. I mean, an agent might be able to do a lot of that within the next 5 years, very competently. Okay. But if you're working as an artist or in other areas, sports, things like that, things that are very human involved, I think, then things change very slowly and much more differently. And I think as well, humans will always default towards wanting human involvement where possible. So, the one I want to always talk about because I like chess a lot and I play chess a lot is, chess computers have been better than humans for a very long time now, for about 4 decades, right? But no one's interested in watching two chess computers have a competition. That's just of no interest, right? You want to see the toil, you want to see human effort, right? You want to see jockeys on horses, you want to see people sitting. We can build racing cars now that can go around a track autonomously, right? But again, who's interested really in watching that? That's not a spectator thing. So, it's going to be, I mean, maybe for a very small niche, but for most people, they wouldn't be interested. So, you know, there will be subjects and areas and things that I think humans continue to kind of have more value in and dominate in for a long time to come. But equally, as I say, there will be areas where this change will happen, and it will be profoundly different for society as a result.
Yeah, yeah, and you can see that that's certainly the case in areas that involve informational knowledge. I mean, skill-based stuff where you've got need somebody to replumb the sink. That's not going to change so quickly. Although robots will be able to do it in due course, but it's some, as you rightly point out, some areas are going to change quicker than others.
Well, and the robot thing is actually really interesting, actually, because if you listen to sort of the CEOs of the big robot companies, and you get them away from their kind of demos, and don't listen to Elon because he just talks nonsense about everything. But if you listen to the more serious robot companies, they'll say, look, it takes us a year to teach it how to use a door handle at the moment. It's a slower process. So AI technology, in terms of the LLMs and the knowledge and intelligence levels, is going much faster than perhaps the robotics is at the moment. And the two things need to be kind of blended together anyway. So maybe we're 20 years away from a robot that can wander around the streets and jump in a car and drive it and do all the things that a human might do. But it will come eventually, but of course there's a cost to it as well, so that needs to come down. But
I'm
if
not
you come
about to
back
say. I mean,
to
I think that's going to be the big thing about robots is the cost. I mean, when the cost falls, lots of people buy them and use them. At the moment, the cost, even the most competent ones are pretty expensive. I was talking to somebody the other day who builds part of the technology for the robots that they use on the International Space Station outside, so that astronauts don't need to go out so much. And they can do a lot of stuff now, but they're not cheap. You're not going to have one of those in your living room or in your kitchen doing the cooking. You're not going to have that anytime soon because they're so expensive. But let me ask you about something else that's interesting. Digital technology means that given what you do, you can compete in a global market because it scales. It's not. It's not at all unusual for a company in Rio de Janeiro to be working with a company in Berlin or something. I mean, working globally is a fantastic opportunity because of digital technology, which of course is what AI sits on top of. Yeah.
absolutely.
But the other side to that is that if you're in that game, you are also competing in a global market. Now, at the moment, countries like the UK and the US are pretty well advanced around things like AI, and some other parts of the world are less advanced. But it won't be long before almost every business that's got a digital backbone to it is competing in a global market. What's your take on the way that's going to impact on how people develop new business models, find different ways to do things, and to come back to your organizational logic, how they evolve their business models quickly to be able to respond to essentially a globally competitive market?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that idea plays out, actually. Because I mean, I think a lot of us thought that, I certainly did, when the internet came along, that would be the kind of great leveler, right? And that the internet means that you could do anything anywhere, and
Yeah.
you could,
But it hasn't,
everyone
is it?
everyone can be the great store online, and all that. But actually, we still ended up with one big store online called Amazon. A
Yeah.
few big distributors of media, and the tech companies are still mostly based in Silicon Valley and China. So it'll be interesting to see if this shift can shift that and truly democratize this stuff, and then you're really in a global market. My instinct is that money is quite good at controlling money, and the sort of the people at the top making the power decisions at a sort of government level are quite good at sort of maintaining that advantage. And I think that's what's happened with the internet. They've allowed certain, Amazon's been allowed to grow to the size it's been. It did it itself, but it's also been allowed to do that. At no point did the US government jump on them and say, "You now need to shrink, mate. You're getting far too big, and we've got to incentivize other organizations." So it'll be interesting to see how they deal with this with AI. My instinct is that let's take the US for example. They're going to do everything they can to help support their companies to continue to dominate because it's in their interest to do that and not to restrict them in any way. And I think actually they did actually with the AI stuff particularly. There was a bill that was passed probably about it must be nearly a year ago now, actually. And they sort of snuck in this kind of clause. It was a bill nothing to do with AI, and then there was this kind of little clause in there about AI that basically said, no one's allowed to restrict the development of AI with US companies for the next decade, or something like that. And it just kind of went through and got passed.
I mean, what
Um,
was actually behind my question was the Chinese, is it DeepSeek? The
yeah.
Chinese AI model that was sort of developed for a few million rather than a few billion that the Americans have spent. It was whether those sorts of, as sort of plucky little upstarts that are not defeated by organizations, because Amazon is doing great, but as with most businesses, it will run up against organizational logic issues, as you describe them, at some point, which is what opens the door for those upstarts to kind of capture ground, find new ways of doing things. I was actually thinking about that kind of thing as much
Well,
as
let's talk about China then. Then that's a very different question. If you say to me globally, and I think will South Africa be a dominant country? Maybe not. But if you say China, I mean, yes, absolutely. And so I'll make some predictions around this. I'm going to say that within a decade, China will dominate in AI potentially because just sheer scale. And if you look at the amount of smart people they've got coming out of university. I think there's more. That's a good example. I spent many years working in the engineering space, and they had more engineers coming out of university than we had students, full stop, coming out of university.
yeah.
And so their ability to throw money at stuff. If you look at what they've done in electric cars in the last sort of 5 years, they essentially went out to like 100 startups in China, the Chinese government, and said, right, here's a load of seed funding money. You go and basically you're now all in competition with each other to build the best technology, and the top three companies in 3 years' time will be the winners, and they'll get the big prize. And so it was like this race to the top. And what you ended up with, is BYD, these companies that are so good, so advanced, way ahead technologically in terms of Tesla and the Europeans, and doing it on scale at half the cost. And so it's hard to imagine a world where China, given enough runway, don't dominate. I mean, and the really interesting one to go off track completely is the environment. I was looking this morning about China and the environment.
Yeah,
They're going green. They're going so green. And of course, even though America tries to hang on to its organizational logic of oil and gas and coal and all of that, right? We know that cannot be the future in 100 years. But China are now obviously going all in on new technologies, which will put them so far ahead in that game when eventually the shift has to happen that they'll dominate. So for me at the moment, it's hard to imagine a future in AI a decade from now that isn't very
yeah.
dominated by China. And that might seem strange because we've got these big American companies at the moment that seem untouchable, but like you say, DeepSeek and these other models, Manus, which is just that's just been bought by Meta actually, but when we look at these other models, their performance level is on par with really what we're seeing,
I mean,
from the US
we
models.
maybe need to come back and talk about this in a decade's time because it will be very interesting to see which way that shakes down. Let
Yeah.
me ask you something though about building your business. Now, I know consultancy businesses are about knowledge and people. A lot of it's to do with people, isn't it? One of the things that every entrepreneur I've spoken to has pretty much said to me that building a business is like, riding a roller coaster. There's good days and bad days.
Yeah.
What is it that gets you out of bed every morning and willing to ride that roller coaster? I mean, what's your take on, what's your motivation?
I think the thing that fires me up at the moment is, it's such an exciting space, right? There's not a day that goes by where I don't read something, see something, and think, wow, okay, that's kind of knocked me off my feet. And so to be working in such an area, such a fast moving area, and to be able to sort of share that excitement, with clients and help them deliver these new technologies and see things transformed in the way that they can be, to me is thrilling, and so that's what motivates me. And then also, being at the cusp when we're setting up the consultancy, we have the opportunity as we build this out and grow this business now to do it, to do it exactly what we're telling our customers. We can build it as an AI native company. We can have a mesh and node structure. We can build unicorn cells that can almost be self-autonomous. We can have AI baked in every layer. I get to do two things. I get to build a company that is kind of like the company that I would dream of building based on the technology that's available. and I get to help other people realize that too. So it's a sort of win-win for me. And it gets me to scratch the itch every day, which is technology, and I love playing with this stuff. So as you probably guessed.
Yeah, no, I'm another one. I like tech as well. I'm not tremendously good with it, but I like it. Let me ask you, when you look back on your journey, and obviously you've done quite a lot of things. What would you say is the most important thing that you've learned along the way? Have there been any sort of moments that have kind of reshaped the way you think about what you do?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Let me think about that. So there have been many moments that have reshaped me along the way. That's the first thing to say. I think probably the biggest thing is being ready to change, actually, being able to understand that, when something happens, often in life things happen to you, right? So I always say to people, you can plan for stuff in life and you're going along quite fine. You think, yeah, in 6 months I'm going to do that, in a year I'm going to do that, and or even, next week my plan is to do that. And there are things that come in from the side that are unseen that just knock you over, right? You couldn't have seen it coming. It's like it's in your blind spot. It just bang, and
Like
suddenly,
COVID for most people.
yes, exactly. And so you wake up the next day and it's like, oh no, everything's different. My future has just moved onto a different track, and I had nothing to say about that. I had no control over that. It just got shunted, basically. And so I think the thing I learned about that along the way is that don't panic. And actually, the thing is, like, you might not always get to choose when the chapter changes, but you do get to write the next chapter, right? That is in your control then, what you do next and how you build forward. And so for me, those moments are always moments of evaluation to sort of stop and look around and think, okay, that's all right, that bit's done now. We've had that moment, and everything's a moment in time. Now we're into a sort of new moment. What do we do now? What does this mean? And through my career, I mean, I've seen the internet come through, mobile technology come through. Now into AI. I mean, I suppose I was sort of there at the beginning of the arrival of the PC, although I was sort of just leaving school, really, sort of 86, 87. But um, you know, those moments have been big shifts, and then there's been obviously lots of personal moments along the way as well that sort of shifted me into a new channel, and then you just look around and think, yeah, okay. And I think it's just being humble and being able to see the opportunities and not panic, really. I mean, my favorite author was Douglas Adams, so from the age of sort of 12 or 13, the words "don't panic" were kind of
Yeah.
emblazoned
Yeah,
into my
I think
brain.
our generation grew up with that, didn't we, really? I mean, he was a favorite.
Honestly, I would say half the reason I'm doing what I'm doing today is because of Douglas Adams. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, to me, I mean, that is the mobile phone, right? That's Google on your mobile phone, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's he saw it all, right? And I think that's what, but those sort of things, don't panic, that kind of stuff just sort of drives me forward, yeah.
Yeah. One last question. Um, what piece of advice, given all the things that you've talked about, if you met a rookie CEO, somebody who's just starting out on the journey of building a business, what what would be the most important piece of advice you'd offer them?
I think the first thing I'd say is just try not to worry, right? I mean,
The
we
don't
can.
panic thing. Yeah.
Yeah, don't panic. We can all lose sleep over every tiny little thing, right? And don't sweat the small stuff too much because things are going to happen that are out of your control, and it's just a case of as I think it was at church or whatever. We see it on the mugs now. Just keep calm and carry on. I think but beyond that, I would say to most CEOs is be brave. Be adventurous. Be prepared to take a risk. I'm a great believer that if you're not prepared to take a risk, you're just going to stay in your box. You're going to stay in your lane, right? And nothing else is going to change, right? That's fine, and a lot of people might choose to do that, and that's how they want to live their life. I mean, but I think Steve Jobs said, didn't he, about sort of hitting the edge of the box and touching the outside of the universe. But you've just got to be able to be brave. I think like Alan Sugar, people like that make those kind of bold decisions sometimes and go for it. And the worst thing that can happen is failure. And as I said earlier, well, that's a learning moment. So there's always something to get from it.
Yeah. Somebody said to me, I can't remember who it was now, but somebody said, where there's no risk, there's no joy. And I think that's a really important. If you want to enjoy life, you've got to take a few risks, I think.
Yeah.
So, Alan, thank you. I mean, a very, really good last piece of wisdom there. So thank you for that. Thank you for taking a bit of time to share the journey. I mean, good luck with the new book. And good luck with the consultancy business. I mean, I think you've probably got a lot of potential clients that will want help, given the things that you've talked about. So good luck. I know you've got big ambitions for it, so good luck going forward with that.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show, Paul. Really enjoyed it, actually.
Likewise. See you soon, Alan. Bye bye.
Thanks. Take care.